In the last video, we discussed the first three beasts that rise from the sea. In this video, we will discuss the fourth beast, and in order to do this, we need to read the rest of the chapter. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked, then, because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there, and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me, and made known to me the interpretation of the things. These four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth. Then I desired to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet, and about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell, the horn that had eyes and a mouth, that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than its companions. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, As for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down, and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law. And they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom, and the dominion, and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Here is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. This is not the sort of chapter where you want to move verse by verse. Instead, what we want to do is jump around and extract any valuable information we can in order to establish the identity of the fourth beast. There's a monologue on the fourth beast given in verses 7 through 8, which emphasizes his strength and terror. It also states that he is different than the other beasts, that he has 10 horns, that one small horn uproots 3 horns that were before it. The small horn has eyes and a mouth, speaking great things. Then we get more information in verses 11 through 12, which says that the beast is speaking great words, it is killed, and its body is given over to be burned by fire. The other beasts lose their dominion, but their lifespan is prolonged, so it's not the same. As where this beast gets burned up, the other beasts continue for a time. Verses 19 through 23 contain repetitions of this information that we've already considered, but there's also some new information. The small horn makes war against the saints and prevails over them. The 3 horns that were displaced by the little horn are identified as being 3 kings. And then finally in verse 25 we get our final note on the fourth beast. He speaks words against the Most High. He wears out the saints. He thinks to change times and laws, and the saints are given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. And so this is the information that we have to work with. Now, verse 8 tells us that the little horn has eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth speaking great things, or as it says in Aramaic, a mouth speaking big. Now, why does this horn get eyes and a mouth? Well, it seems to be stock language for arrogance. The eyes and the mouth are oftentimes metonyms for a unusually arrogant person in Scripture, as it is in Isaiah 2. The eyes of the arrogant will be humbled, and human pride brought low. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day. The eyes again show up in Proverbs 21. Haughty eyes and a proud heart, the unplowed field of the wicked, produce sin. The mouth, of course, 1 Samuel chapter 2, do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance, for the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. They close up their callous hearts, and their mouths speak with arrogance. And so if you just look for these passages, and there are many others that could be mentioned, the eyes and the mouth are oftentimes associated with someone whose arrogance is disproportionate to reality. Now, what you will find in the commentaries is that almost universally, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a Greek king who persecuted the people of God in the 160s BC, is thought to be the little horn. Even those who have a futurist interpretation, who believe that the little horn is ultimately the Antichrist, they tend to believe that this Greek king, Antiochus IV, is a precursor to the Antichrist. And so we're going to talk a lot about Antiochus as we go throughout these chapters, weighing whether or not he is a good fit for these prophecies. Now, it says a mouth speaking big. Now, this is interesting because look at what First Maccabees says about Antiochus. It says Antiochus took the silver and the gold and the costly vessels. That is, he took all these things out of God's temple. He is desecrating the temple. He took also the hidden treasures which he found. Taking them all, he departed to his own land. He committed deeds of murder and spoke with great arrogance. So that is similar to this horn with this big mouth. Now, from 173 or 172 BC, some of Antiochus's coins carried the epithet Theos Epiphanos, which means God manifest. And so oftentimes these coins where Antiochus declares his own divinity have been thought to be the historical corollary for this symbol of a horn who speaks great things against the Most High, who utters these types of blasphemy. Now, if we continue this line of logic that says Antiochus IV is the little horn that comes up among the 10, uprooting 3 along the way, well, we have some difficulty here establishing the identity of the 10 horns. Now, some will say that Daniel chapter 11 is the answer, because after Alexander the Great dies and his kingdom is divided up into 4 kingdoms, well, the 2 that are relevant to the land of Israel are the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. The Seleucids and the Ptolemies are the 2 Greek kingdoms that continually vie and war over the land of Israel. Well, Daniel 11 mentions a total of 12 Greek kings between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies combined who are relevant to the land of Israel. And so the 10 horns here may just be a rounding off of the 12. Right? The 10 horns are just a nice round number to represent these 12 Greek kings. Others will point out that Antiochus is a Seleucid king. He's not a Ptolemaic king. The Ptolemies were the Greeks who reigned over Egypt, but the Seleucids were those who reigned over the area that we would call Syria and Iraq, that whole area in the Middle East. Well, Antiochus was a Seleucid king, and he was the 8th one. So again, we would have a rounding off. Maybe these 10 horns represent the 8 kings in the Seleucid line, with Antiochus being number 8. Now, it's interesting here. Many interpreters, I'd say most interpreters, seem comfortable with taking the 10 horns as a round number. It's not specific. It either represents the 12 kings of the Seleucids and Ptolemies combined in Daniel 11, or it's a rounding off of the 8 kings in the Seleucid line, the 8th king being Antiochus. But even though they're willing to say that the 10 horns are rounding off, most interpreters believe that the 3 horns that get uprooted are specific, that they represent 3 specific kings. Now, you may look at that and say, well, that's inconsistency. How can the 10 just be a rounding off, but the 3 have to be specific? Well, yeah, that is a little bit inconsistent, but most Bible scholars go with that. Nevertheless, even though most are not hell-bent on identifying exactly 10 kings to correspond to the 10 horns, the 3 that get uprooted usually we want specific kings to represent those. Now, one idea is that it's international war, that anyone that Antiochus defeated in war who represents a foreign country, this could be the 3 horns that are uprooted. And one view is that it's Ptolemy the Sixth and Ptolemy the Seventh and Artaxias of Armenia. These are foreigners who are defeated by Antiochus. An alternative view is to replace Artaxias of Armenia with Cleopatra II. However, most will not go with that. Most do not think that we're looking at a story of international war here, of Antiochus defeating foreign monarchs. Most think this is a story of intrigue. That is, that he is conspiring and he's working behind the scenes in Seleucia, trying to knock off other contenders for the throne so that he can claim it for himself. So this would be just kind of a standard Game of Thrones story, as it were. So if this is the case, who are the 3 Seleucids that Antiochus could be responsible for killing or getting rid of in order that he could secure the throne for himself? Well, one option is that it could be his own father, who's pictured here on the left, Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great as he was known. He met a violent end, and Antiochus IV may have been thought to have been responsible in some way for this, though he was in Rome at the time. Antiochus was there, Antiochus IV, that is, he was in Rome as a prisoner of war, as a hostage, while his father, Antiochus III, was killed. We don't know that Antiochus IV, was responsible for this. There's no evidence for this, but then again, if you lived in Daniel's time, there may have been some suspicion. People might have known something that we don't. Another option is that it's Antiochus IV's elder brother and his predecessor, Seleucus IV. After his father, Antiochus III, died, well, the guy in line to reign is Antiochus IV's older brother, who is Seleucus IV. Right? Now, Seleucus IV was murdered by his prime minister, Heliodorus, and there is no evidence that Antiochus was behind this. At this time, he was in Athens, though he may have been. Right? Certainly, Seleucus' murder opened the way to the throne for Antiochus because, his older brother is on the throne. He's the one who's supposed to reign. Seleucus dies. This opens up a path so that Antiochus IV can come in and claim the throne for himself. Again, we don't have any specific evidence that Antiochus IV was behind his brother's death, though he may. Now, his older brother, Seleucus, he had a son who should have taken the throne after his father died, Demetrius I. But Demetrius I was now in Rome. See, when Antiochus IV, our bad guy here that we're talking about, the potential little horn, he was in Rome as a prisoner of war. Well, they're not going to let him loose unless somebody replaces him. And so Demetrius comes and replaces Antiochus for a while. This lets Antiochus IV loose. Well, Demetrius was in line for the throne, but he was not able to take it after his father dies because he's, in Rome as a hostage of war, to replace his uncle, Antiochus IV. And so this could be another horn that was uprooted. Certainly Demetrius was in line for the throne, but because he had to replace Antiochus in Rome, he was not able to go and secure his throne in time. Another view is that Seleucus's younger son, whose name was also Antiochus, and that's why this can be confusing, but Seleucus, after he dies, Seleucus has the throne, his son uh, Antiochus was proclaimed king and acted as co-regent with Antiochus IV. All right, so we have two Antiochus here, the son of the king, and also uh, his uncle, Antiochus IV, the bad guy we're talking about. For 5 years, they were co-regents, but Antiochus IV eventually had the younger Antiochus killed, which he would definitely be one of the little horns who is replaced here. And so whether, it's his father, Antiochus III, whether it's his nephew, Demetrius I, whether it's, Antiochus, this younger Antiochus, there are a number of figures here who could represent one of the three horns who is displaced by Antiochus as he is ascending to the throne. When I recorded the last few slides, I was concerned that they might not make much sense, so I very quickly threw this slide together to try to make it more clear. And here we have Antiochus IV, this is our bad guy, and this is the family tree. All right, you have Antiochus III or Antiochus the Great. He has two sons, Seleucus IV, the king, and his brother Antiochus IV, our bad guy. Seleucus IV also has two sons, a younger Antiochus and Demetrius I. So Antiochus IV is sitting in a jail in Rome. He's a prisoner of war, and Antiochus III is on the throne, and he dies. He is succeeded by Seleucus IV. Well, about that time, while Seleucus IV is on the throne, Antiochus IV, his brother, is released from jail in Rome because Demetrius here, his nephew, the son of Seleucus, is going to replace him there. You can get out as long as somebody else of the royal line will come and sit in jail. Well, so Antiochus is released and he is replaced by Demetrius. And while Antiochus is on his way back and he's going through Athens, Seleucus IV dies. Right? Now, Seleucus IV, his death could have something to do with Antiochus IV. We don't know. But when he dies, when Seleucus dies, he's supposed to be replaced by Demetrius I. But Demetrius I is sitting in the Roman jail. He replaced Antiochus IV. He had no idea his father was about to die, and so he's not able to take the throne, even though it's rightfully his. Antiochus IV takes it. And while Demetrius I is in jail, Antiochus IV reigns as co-regent with the younger Antiochus for 5 years before Antiochus IV has the younger Antiochus killed, his nephew. And so whether it's Antiochus III, his brother Seleucus, or one of his two nephews, three of these figures are likely, if Antiochus IV is indeed, if he is the little horn in Daniel, one of these four guys, three of these four guys are likely the reference in terms of the three horns that got uprooted by the little horn, Antiochus IV. So in verse 25, it says that he shall change times and laws. Now, what could this refer to? It is often assumed that he tried to exchange the 364-day solar calendar with a 360-day lunar calendar. There is no evidence for this. In fact, and I've heard this view a number of times, it's surprising how popular this view has been, considering there is no evidence for this. Maybe just because it says he changes times, this sounds like a calendar change and someone just ran with it and other people believed it. But there is, in fact, no evidence for this view. Probably it is a reference to his prohibition against the Sabbath and festival days. That's probably what it means when it says he changed times. Now, consider this passage from 1 Maccabees describing Antiochus IV and his reign of terror in Jerusalem. They erected a desolating sacrilege upon the altar of burnt offering. They also built altars in the surrounding cities of Judah and burned incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The books of the law which they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. This is a reference to the law of Moses. Where the book of the covenant was found in the possession of anyone, or if anyone adhered to the law, the decree of the king condemned him to death. And so obviously you cannot practice Sabbath or the festivals under threat of the capital punishment. And so the reference to changing times and laws, this is probably what this refers to. Now it says that he will have his reign of terror for a time, times, and half a time. Now what might a time refer to? Now some suggest it's going to be 3.5 years because a time is a year in Daniel chapter 9. So just using Daniel to interpret Daniel, a time is most likely a year. Now it says time, times, and half a time. So a time is a year, times would be 2 years, and then half a time would be half a year. And so you end up with 3.5 years. Now, it's interesting because the desecration of the temple under Antiochus Epiphanes took place on December 6th of 167, and its purification was on December 14th of 164. And so this is not quite 3.5 years. It was 3 years and 8 days. So how do we account for the difference? Well, some will say it does not need to be 3.5 years exactly, because it is either half of 7 or it conveys a period that threatens to grow longer and longer but is suddenly broken off by judgment. So in other words, 7 is a perfect number in Scripture, right? So what is 3.5? Well, it's half of 7. So, if 7 is perfect, 3.5 represents imperfection. If 7 is holy, then 3.5 is unholy. And so while the literal period of desecration was a little over 3 years, it wasn't quite 3.5 years. The idea may not be temporal strictness here. The idea here may be symbolism. We're going to say it's 3.5 because that's half of 7, and therefore 3.5 is an evil number. Others have suggested that there's a different type of logic taking place here. If we were to say 1, 2, 4, 8, let's just say we doubled, all right? Some people say that is the logic here, that it was time, then it's times, and then next you should expect it to be 4 times. It's supposed to just continue to grow. The horn intends for his reign to just keep growing from time to times, to more times, to even more times. But what happened? Well, he's on the ascension here, time, times, and then God intervenes and cuts off his reign half a time. All right, so he thought he would continue to multiply times, but then it suddenly gets cut off. Some people think that that is the logic here, and this would make for a type of ironic judgment, because remember what it said earlier, he tries to change times and laws. Well, let's say it's not about Sabbath and it's not about festivals. I think it is, but this idea is also interesting. Let's say that the times that he tries to change are the appointed times for his rulership, the appointed times given by God. God has appointed each king a maximum amount of time that they might reign in the earth. But his given time is inviolable, right? He seeks to change times. He wants to elongate his reign, but times, and then suddenly cut off half a time shows that he was not able to change the number of times that he reigns, but in fact, God cut it off as he always intended to do, because God is sovereign in determining the number of times that are given to a king to reign. A king, no matter how blasphemous or how cheeky he is, he cannot determine the set number of times for his own rule. All these things are in God's hand. And so this is the idea here. Some people will say it is 3.5 years. Some people will say it doesn't literally need to be 3.5 years. That's a symbol. It's half of 7, or it just shows that he tried to multiply times for his rulership, but they just suddenly got cut off because God determines times. The king does not. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking, and as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. Now, this is a harsh judgment here that in Scripture is usually reserved for only the worst of the worst. If a man takes a woman and her mother also, it is depravity. He and they shall be burned with fire, that there may be no depravity among you. It's interesting. Homosexuality in the Old Testament was a capital offense, but homosexuals were not burned. But if a man lays with a woman and her mother, they are burned. This is a heterosexual sin that was so grievous in God's sight that it even provoked a harsher penalty than homosexuality. Leviticus 21, and the daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by whoring, profanes her father, she shall be burned with fire. So very few instances of someone being burned with fire because of their sins. And so he's right up here among the worst of the worst. Now, within the context of the book of Daniel, Newsom has made this observation. Whereas Nebuchadnezzar's superheated fire had no power over the bodies of the three young men, remember back in chapter 3, the fire of divine judgment destroys the body of the beast, representing the fourth kingdom. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Now, what could that be a reference to? That's very difficult. It's very much debated. But many will point out that Babylon, Media, and Persia, the other beasts, they kept their identity in some measure even after the loss of their empires. For example, Media and Persia kept a degree of independence as the principalities of Atropatian Media and Persis. And you can see here these regions on the screen. This cannot be said of the Seleucid Empire. After they're overtaken by Rome, they're gone. And so there is a difference here. Now, we've talked for some time about what this could possibly mean. Some will suggest that, yeah, the Greek Seleucid Empire is a partial fulfillment, but many things throughout Daniel that we will find in these last 6 chapters, they're not going to fit so well. They'll fit kind of, but they're not going to fit so well. And that's because the greater fulfillment is deferred until the time of the Antichrist. Whatever your position is on that, we must admit at the very least that these passages in the book of Daniel have had a massive influence on the book of Revelation. And while I have discussed these things in my videos on the book of Revelation, I want to take a little bit of time here to talk about the impact of this chapter on the book of Revelation. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. Now this is interesting because in the book of Daniel, the 10 horns, are past tense. 3 of them get replaced by a smaller horn, etc. Well, in Revelation 17, these are also 10 horns that represent kings, but they're in the future, those that will rule immediately prior to the time of Christ. And Revelation, again, uses numbers differently. Triangular numbers are evil, square numbers are righteous, and rectangular numbers are neutral. There are a number of places in my videos where I discuss this. You can go and watch, for example, the videos in Revelation 11 and 13 if you're interested in the way mathematics is used in the book of Revelation. But a triangular number, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 equals 10, that is an evil number. And so this passage here in Daniel gets incorporated into the book of Revelation with some ease because it fits right into its numerical schemes. And again, this is contrasted, right? You have the 10-horned beast in Daniel, but he has no good counterpart, unlike the book of Revelation. You have a 10-horned beast, but then you have the 7-horned lamb as his opposite. All this talk in the book of Daniel about this horn having a big mouth, well, this language gets, transferred in the book of Revelation, not just onto one of the beast's horns, but onto the beast himself. And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. Again, there it is, 3.5 years. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. And in the book of Revelation, blasphemy is also a word that can be translated as slander. We saw this back in Revelation chapter 2, where the church is being slandered to the authorities. And so the authorities are coming in and persecuting the people of God. So you have this 3.5 years, you have this slander, this big mouth effect, as it were. All of this shows up in the book of Revelation. Now, again, this 3.5 years representing persecution of the people of God, this is a major topos in the book of Revelation. Again, we're looking at Israel giving birth to the Messiah here. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Again, another way of saying 3.5 years. And 1,260 is a rectangular number. Again, I refer you to the video I made on Revelation chapter 12. And so here we see it again. Except the 3.5 year period in the book of Revelation is not literally 3.5 years. Again, you can see my videos on Revelation 12 and 13, where you'll see that 3.5 years represents all the martyrs and all the persecution of God's people that take place throughout the church age. Daniel 7:11 says, I looked then because of the sound of the great words of the horn he was speaking, and as I looked, the beast was killed, and his body was given to the flame. Now this is interesting, because what happens to the beast in Revelation? And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet, who in its presence had done the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast, and those who worshipped its image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. So this picture of the beast being given to the flames in Daniel, this is conducive to the development of the lake of fire imagery, this famous image in the book of Revelation, this terrible image. This owes its provenance to the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, the beast conquers the saints. He makes war with them and prevails against them. Again, this language gets picked up in Revelation 13, where the beast was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. But again, the book of Revelation is going to develop this idea further. There is going to be an irony here, that when the beast kills us, he thinks he is conquering us, and he indeed is on an earthly military level, but on an eternal level, it is the non-violent martyr who loses his life who is actually done the conquest, and they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even unto death. So the irony in Revelation is that when your enemy conquers you with violence, you have in fact conquered him in an eternal sense, because you will prevail on Judgment Day. Okay, let's go back to Daniel chapter 7 and look at verse 9. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days, this is a reference to God, the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. Now, the reference to thrones, how do we account for this? Rabbi Akiva is said to have explained them as one for him and one for David, that is, one for the Lord and one for the Messiah. Now, later rabbinic sources, perhaps responding to Christian claims, insist that Daniel 7:9 does not refer to two powers, but to two aspects of the same God. In other words, they didn't like this idea that, oh, you have a throne for God and then you have one for his Messiah. That sounds too Christian. And so eventually the rabbis would give this idea up, because they didn't want it to play into the hands of Christian interpreters. Now, more likely what you have here is a reference to the divine council. this famous text in Psalm 82 that says that God took his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. Now, again, I've referred to this elsewhere in this study, that when it says gods here, it does not mean gods as though they're Yahweh's equals. The word is Elohim, which sometimes just refers to a being from the spirit realm, not one that is equal with Yahweh. And then in this passage, Yahweh gives these divine beings a butt chewing because they did not reign over the earth with justice. These members of this council that we see a number of places in Scripture, such as in Kings and Revelation chapter 4, etc. They are supposed to reign over the world in justice, but they do not do so. And so that now sometimes they don't do so. Right? There are other places where the divine council does really well, and there are places where it does not do so well. Psalm 82 is a place where it doesn't do so well. But nevertheless, that is probably who this is here, sitting in these seats. It's the divine council. Now, of course, this white hair, white clothing, all this, whiteness can be a mark of purity, eternality, or it may just reflect heavenly splendor. You're used to things from heaven being white in Scripture. Now, this brings me to another point here. God being depicted here as an old man with white hair and a white robe, etc. It's interesting that Scripture does this, not because God literally looks this way. Right? This is symbolism. This is apocalyptic literature. You're not supposed to think, well, God is a man with white hair. But it's interesting that the biblical writer feels comfortable depicting God this way, at least in a metaphor, at least in symbolism. There was this book that came out called The Shack, and a movie was made also. And I remember that somebody told me they didn't like it, and I asked why. And she told me that God is not a big black woman, right? And that's why she didn't like the movie, because God was depicted symbolically as a big black woman. Well, in Scripture, God is depicted as a man with white hair, right? If God can be symbolically depicted as a man with white hair, why can't he be symbolically depicted as a black woman, right? What is the difference? The man with the white hair, that's meant to show how ancient he is, how pure he is, how he is a great judge. Well, if this book or movie wants to capture the loving nature of God, and so symbolically depicts God as a big black woman, well, what's wrong with that? And again, I'm not endorsing every bit of theology in that book or in that movie. There are places that are problematic, but for the most part, it is pretty good. And I know that there are purists and naysayers who are going to take fault with anything, and those folks aren't going to like the book. And there are parts, I think, especially parts that try to weaken the wrath of God in The Shack that are unacceptable to me. But other than that, it tends to be a pretty good work of art, and tends to be pretty biblical. Now it says that there is a fiery will. The best point of comparison we have for this is the book of Ezekiel, where God's war chariot is above these wills within a will. And the idea here in Ezekiel is to compare with earthly rulers. So the Babylonians came and took the people of God away into exile, and their greatest weapons against Israel were their war chariots. This is what made the Babylonians so fearsome. However, the Babylonian war chariots had a major flaw. They were difficult to turn. It took a lot to turn these chariots. So when God shows up in Ezekiel in his own war chariot, and it has wheels within a wheel, and it can go any direction without even turning, well, the point is that God has greater war chariots than those who took you captive. The Babylonian war chariots can hardly turn at all, but God's chariot has wheels within wheels, and it can go any direction because his war vehicle is so much more mobile, so much more agile, so much more effective than that of Israel's enemies. Now that's the idea in Ezekiel. This is the only real point of comparison from the period that we have to this vision here in Daniel. So it may, again, have a similar meaning. It may show the superiority of God's war chariot. Verse 10 says, "A stream of fire issued and came from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened." Now, this is the divine council opening the books that they might make a decision. But it's interesting, just as an aside before we begin, that the Mormons have a very particular interpretation of this. Now, in Mormonism, you have the Bible, which they believe has been corrupted over time, but then they have the scriptures that they don't think have been corrupted. The Book of Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price, and the Doctrine and Covenants. And the Doctrine and Covenants has an interpretation of this particular scene in Daniel. He says, "Among the great and mighty ones who were assembled in this vast congregation of the righteous were Father Adam, the Ancient of Days, and Father of all, and our glorious Mother Eve, with many of her faithful daughters, who had lived through the ages and worshipped the true and living God." And now this is interesting because according to them, Adam is the Ancient of Days. And if you talk to a Mormon, I talked to a couple of Mormon missionaries who had never even heard anything different. They knew that the Ancient of Days was Adam, and they didn't even know there was another perspective. Now this is interesting because in Christianity and Judaism, we've always understood the Ancient of Days in this scene to represent God. In fact, things got a little out of hand in early Mormonism. The second prophet in Mormonism, Brigham Young, stated that Adam just was God, just straight up. Adam was God. And this is a teaching that they've been trying to get away from now for a long time, that their prophet had actually taught this. According to them, this scene here is not in heaven. It is in Spring Hill, Missouri, according to a vision which their founder, Joseph Smith, received on May 19th, 1838. Now, you will not be surprised that here in this scene, there is a chiasm. This scene is structured. It's not as random as it seems to be. You get the vision report at the beginning, and you get a visionary's response at the end. The second thing you get is the appearance of the four creatures. Well, the second to last thing you get is the man-like figure appearing, etc. And all of this focuses in on the center, verses 9 through 10, where there is a throne scene. So the point here is the sovereignty of God. It's not the animals. It's not these beast empires who are sovereign in creation. It is the Ancient of Days, the one who sits on the throne. Now it says a stream of fire. In Scripture, God's presence is depicted as a smoking fire pot, a burning bush, a mountain that quakes and smokes, and a pillar of fire that leads Israel through the wilderness. Now this just emphasizes the otherliness of God. Fire is something that is dangerous to humans, but God is indestructible, and so he dwells with fire. He is not vulnerable in the way that we are to existential destruction. Now, it says the books were opened. Now, this is interesting. What are these books? Well, these books represent the memory of God. They record the deeds of people throughout their lives and throughout human history. You have taken account of my wanderings, put my tears in your bottle, and are they not in your book? Behold, it is written before me. I will not keep silent, but I will repay. I will even repay into their bosom. Now notice it is written before me. And in the book of Enoch, in the Second Temple period, this theme of the book continues. And I observed the heavenly tablets, and I read everything which was written thereon, and understood everything, and read the book of all the deeds of mankind, and of all the children of flesh that shall be upon the earth to the remotest generations. There are many who don't want to accept that our deeds and works will be brought into account at the judgment, even those of us who are Christian people. But it's interesting. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:10 that we must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ to receive for what we have done in the body, whether good or evil. And then this imagery, of course, shows up in the book of Revelation at the great white throne judgment. And I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne. And the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged from the things which were written in the books according to their deeds. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them, and they were judged every one according to their deeds. And so there's been a push by many, and I'm Protestant, so I can say this, there's been a push by many, especially Protestants, to say that these books are not a record of deeds, right? That all that's going to count is whether or not you had faith. Well, this is not true. We see time and time again in Scripture that there will be a judgment according to works. What did Jesus teach in the parable of the sheep and the goats? The criteria was what you had done. The passage I quoted a moment ago from Paul, 2 Corinthians 5:10, he says the same thing in Romans 2:6. The book of Revelation says this sort of thing many times. And I encourage you to go and watch my video on Revelation chapter 20, where I examine at length the role of your deeds, the role of your works in the final judgment.